afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third LBTT webinar that we're running, this one being on LBTT leases and the further returns regime. There's quite a bit to get through today, so apologies if we don't go into as much detail as you would like. However, I'd encourage anyone listening to use the Q&A box that should be on your interface to ask questions as you go. We'll try and pick these up, as many as possible. However, any we don't answer, we will deal with by email afterwards. Likewise, if you have any questions that occur after the seminar, please do feel free to email them through to us. Our details are at the front of the slides. We will, of course, be sending out copies of the slides in PDF format. So today's webinar is on LBTT leases. So we're going to go through a quick overview of leases and the further review returns that are required. We're going to look at the kind of reminders that Revenue Scotland send out and the issues with that, as well as some of the rules around extensions, variations, assignations, and renunciations of leases that we find can trip people up from time to time. So, overview of the LBTT lease regime. This is very closely modelled on the SDLT regime. However, there are some very important differences in there which are designed to make the tax actually work in the context of Scottish leases, which SDLT never did. The first major difference is, of course, that under SDLT, you only ever looked at the first 5 years of the lease to work out what the taxable rents were, and then you chose the highest rent and carried it forward for years 6 onwards. Under LBTT, we look at the actual rent payable under every year of the lease. So if you have a 75-year lease, that means when you go into the calculator, you have 75 years of rent to fill in.
And the point is that Scottish leases are quite different from English leases. They're more flexible, they're more like contracts, so we can extend them more easily and vary them. So what you really need to collect all the LBTT on the rent is more of a video than a snapshot. So the system that was devised for LBTT was a 3-yearly review system to ensure that the rent or the LBTT that you estimated at the beginning of the lease based on the estimated rent gets trued up to the actual rent paid. And the aim of the game is that you pay LBTT on the rent that's actually paid under the lease. So the advantage of the system, once it really gets bedded in, is that you don't have to do additional returns for extensions and variations of leases. But at the moment, because we're in a kind of transitional phase, we've still got SDLT leases around, and there can be LBTT returns for extensions or variations of them. When do you have to do the 3-yearly returns? In the title we've said 3-yearly, etc. review returns, because it's obviously not only every 3 years. Well, the first return you would be doing when the tenant takes entry or the lease is granted, so that's at the beginning. And then the 3-yearly returns you have to do every 3 years from when the first return is due. So there's a kind of review date, which is 3 years from the effective date, and you have to do the return within 30 days of that. But you also have to do one of these review returns if you assign a lease or if the lease terminates. And there are other relatively complicated situations when you have to do them, such as 3 years from when a growing lease or tacitly relocating lease becomes notifiable. So you'd have to do the first one when it became notifiable, and then you have to do other returns 3 years after that, and 3 years again, 3 years, 6 years, and so on. This regime obviously only applies to non-residential leases because we only have LBTT on non-residential leases. But of course that includes some things you might think of as being residential, such as care homes, old-style student accommodation, and so on, together with the other things that are non-residential, because there are a lot of them. So a lease of 6 or more residential property is tipped into being non-residential, so it's caught by the 3-yearly returns and so on. First 3-yearly returns fell due this year because LBTT was introduced on the 1st of April 2015, as we all remember. So it's still a new thing, and it's still possible that people will not be totally aware of it. Certainly tenants won't be. And one aspect, of course, is that when we submit LBTT returns on behalf of tenants, we generally, and I'm sure most people listening will also do, what we generally do is say to the tenant, this is your LBTT return, you'll have to do some more returns every 3 years. We're not responsible for those, although we're delighted to help you if you want us to, but we're not sort of taking responsibility for reminding you. So, of course, there's probably tenants out there who haven't got the message yet, although Revenue Scotland have been making a lot of attempts to reach tenants in all sorts of different areas. So one of the things they've been doing is sending reminders to tenants. Tenants don't have to get their solicitors to submit 3-yearly returns, by the way. If tenants are companies or other bodies that could sign up for the LBTT online system, then tenant can actually do the return themselves, and that is happening. It's a slightly less efficient access to the online system as compared with what solicitors and other tax advisors have, but it's still a possibility. So what's the review return about? Well, it's about revising the MPV calculation using revised rental figures, depending on what the actual rent paid is compared to the estimated rent. So when you do the first return, you estimate the rent. When you do the 3-yearly return, you kind of review that position and say, have any of these rental figures changed? You know, we estimated one thing. Did we pay something else? If so, that's what you put in the MPV calculation. This is yet another reason why you need to keep the MPV calculations from the first return, so that you can figure out, so that you can be sure it makes sense. So what you have to do is work out the revised MPV and then work out the LBTT, and you either have to pay some more to Revenue Scotland, or you can reclaim it from Revenue Scotland if the new LBTT payable is less.
Now, this obligation broadly applies to all LBTT leases as soon as a return goes in. That, if you like, sets the clock ticking on the 3-year returns that fall due. However, there's a couple of important exceptions to that, and the main one is that if the original lease is subject to a relief that grants 100% relief from LBTT, such as group relief or sale and leaseback relief, then that lease falls outside the scope of the 3-year returns rules, and no 3-yearly returns need to be submitted. Same with the Assignation and Renunciation returns. Revenue Scotland reminders, it's important to know, first of all, that if you are assisting a tenant with one of these things, that the reminders tend to go to the client and not to the agents. You might not necessarily see them or be aware that a reminder has gone out. Another thing we've noticed with some of these reminders is that they can have the wrong date and tell you that a return is due even when it isn't. Now, you'll have to forgive sort of going off into a slightly technical point here, but the issue here is the difference between the relevant date and the effective date for each transaction that the reminder is issued for. You'll know from the LBTT returns that we do have to put in separate relevant dates and effective dates, but there's no real clear guidance on what they are. A very, very kind of quick and dirty explanation, the relevant date, a transaction can have a lot of relevant dates, and the relevant date is each time a return is due, a relevant date is triggered. So each return will have a different relevant date, and a lease will have many relevant dates over its life, because each 3-year return and assignation return will trigger one. Whereas the effective date is the date that the transaction completed or was substantially performed. And what the effective date does is locks in the tax rules that apply to the lease over its life. So a lease will only ever have really one effective date, and that means one set of tax rules will apply to it. So even if the rates change, you don't have to account for those rate changes in further returns. Now, technically, LBTT review returns are always due on the third anniversary of the relevant date, but what we've noticed Revenue Scotland doing is sending out reminders based on the effective date instead.
I suppose the point there is that the relevant date may be later than the effective date, so with a lease that didn't have to be notified straight away, the first LBTT return could be a couple of years after the lease was granted. So we've seen reminders from Revenue Scotland which are saying that there's already an LBTT return, a 3-yearly return due, but it's just wrong because we've not got to 3 years from the relevant date. So that's the point.
Indeed, and it's important that you have to rebut that to Revenue Scotland if it happens, because otherwise they may seek to charge penalties if a return isn't submitted. It's also, of course, possible that a tenant or your client will move advisors over the course of a lease. So you might find yourself trying to submit a return on behalf of a tenant for whom you didn't act when the lease was entered into, and you might not have details of the first return. Revenue Scotland will send these out to you, but you have to send in an agent mandate or authorisation form, which can be downloaded from their website in order to get them to talk to you. Finally, just a bit of good practice. If you're claiming a refund rather than saying that additional tax is due, it's always worth, in our view, sending Revenue Scotland a computation, for example, through the SETS secure messenger, simply so that Revenue Scotland will be able to see that the amount you're claiming is correct. Otherwise, they might ultimately query that.
So it just speeds up the process. When you're doing the 3-yearly return, it's a kind of fairly simple approach. So you look back at the previous 3 years and you look at the rent that was actually paid. So if there's been rent reviews or whatever it is, you look at the rent. You still look at the rent that was actually paid, even if a rent review has been sort of on the go, but if nothing has been paid under it yet, then you don't need to include that in the return. With wind farm leases and things like that, it's particularly important to address the 3-yearly return issue both before the lease is even granted and afterwards. Before the lease is granted, for these types of projects where you have a kind of cash flow forecasting situation and the LBTT payments are part of the financial model, you have to kind of work out an estimate of when the additional LBTT will be paid throughout the term of the lease. And also, a lot of these projects, they start off with one kind of finance and then they get refinanced after the build stage. So again, whoever's coming in to do the refinancing will want to know that the returns are all up to date. Clearly, you'll be in a lot better position if you keep copies of the returns and the computations to back up the MPV, including the basis on which you arrived at figures. Even if it's just the client said the rent was this, it's worth having that all in one place. You have to do a 3-yearly return even if nothing has changed. So there's absolutely nothing that's changed in terms of the lease rental or the term of the lease. You still have to do one. It won't be very difficult, of course, because it'll be just the same as the first one. But there are penalties for failing to do 3-yearly returns. There are penalties even if there's no additional LBTT due, because nothing has changed. And the maximum penalty, actually, if there's no LBTT due, is £1,500. So that's quite a chunky sum. If there is LBTT payable and the return is late, you can get a late return penalty plus a late payment penalties, plus late payment penalties, I should say, plus, if it's very late, a tax geared penalty. So that could be a lot of penalties. It's really important to try and make sure that these returns are done.
Someone's asked here, if your client doesn't receive a reminder from Revenue Scotland, will you still get a penalty for late filing of a 3-year return? And the answer to that one is yes. There's no statutory obligation on Revenue Scotland to issue these reminders. This is something they have agreed to do after a bit of pressure in order to help this system bed in, but there's no guarantee they'll continue doing that, and that the penalties regime is completely independent of the reminders that are sent out.
Yeah. So if tenants aren't aware of it, then and just haven't received a reminder because it could have gone to the wrong address or all sorts of things, some of which you might try and argue was a reasonable excuse for not putting in the return. And there are some people who believe that getting a penalty for a tax return where there's no tax due is a bit much. So, you know, there are continuing efforts to try and get rid of these penalties where there's no tax. But at the moment, they are due. It's not all bad news, though, because it's not always a payment. There can be a repayment if the rent's gone down or whatever it is, or there were overestimates. And also there can be a repayment if the lease terminates. So if it's renounced or irritated or whatever it is, then you can get your money back for the wasted years. And that's a change of view by Revenue Scotland. So some of the old guidance that's floating around is wrong in that respect. The current position is they accept that you can get a repayment if the lease, if it's a 15-year lease that's renounced after 10 years, then you can get kind of 5 years worth of LBTT back, which is a good thing.
And that's also a change from SDLT, where that generally just is not possible. Extensions and variations of LBTT leases. This is one of the areas where there's a great deal of simplicity, unless you're dealing with an existing SDLT lease. The basic position is that unless you are paying a premium to extend or vary a lease, and by you I mean the tenant, then there's no separate return that needs to be submitted. You simply sweep it up in the next 3-year assignation or termination return that goes in. So, for example, a 5-year lease, in its initial return, the term is 5 years. When you do your 3rd year return, you'll still be calculating the term on the basis of 5 years. But when you get to year 4, let's say, the parties agree to extend the lease to 7 years. You don't do a termination return at the end of year 5. Instead, you just do an extra 3-yearly return at the end of year 6, but assuming a 7-year term. Similar rule kind of applies for tacit relocation as well, in that if the lease gets to the end of its term and starts tacitly relocating, you don't do a termination return. However, once it's tacitly relocated for 3 years or thereabouts, you'll have another 3-yearly return. Those just keep on running. If it terminates and the tacit relocation ends before the next 3-year return, then you just have a termination return at that point.
So the idea is that this makes it a lot easier to deal with, and you effectively just keep doing 3-yearly returns so long as the lease is going on. If you assign it or it's terminated, that's a different matter, but it's supposed to be a relatively simple process. However, it's a bit messed up by having to deal with SDLT and stamp duty leases. If there's an existing SDLT lease and it's extended after the 1st of April 2015, that is treated as the grant of a new LBTT lease for the period of the extension. And it's an LBTT lease where the tax charge is based on the extension period and the passing rent. So if it was a 10-year SDLT lease with a rent of 100k and you extend it by 4 years, what you've got is an LBTT lease for 4 years with a rent of 100k. You don't have to join them together and pay LBTT on the whole 14 years. So you've got an LBTT lease for 4 years with a rent of 100k, and it drops into the 3-yearly review process. So you have to do 3-yearly review returns on that kind of notional LBTT lease. Variations of SDLT leases. If you get a variation after the 1st of April 2015 to increase the rent, that's treated as the grant of a new lease for LBTT purposes as well. And the LBTT is paid on the varied rent, less the rent previously payable for the remainder of the lease, which is a long-winded way of saying it's the increase in the rent. You may remember there was some toing and froing about what exactly the LBTT charge was based on when LBTT first came in, but that's now been settled. So the 3-yearly review date on this notional LBTT lease run from the date that it was treated as being granted. Bear in mind that you can get into some nightmarishly complicated situation where you've not just got one SDLT lease, but under SDLT itself, it might have been varied or extended or whatever it is. So you've got a whole cluster of SDLT leases of, different notional ones. And if you extend the real lease, once you're in LBTT land, or, post 1st April 2015, then you might have a number of notional LBTT leases. But that's too hard to even think about for very long.
Yes, I mean, the point there really is, although the rent increases rules are tied to the first 5 years, if you have a lease with lots of historical variations, some of those could bring that 5-year clock forward or reset it. So it's just worth thinking through if you encounter one of those leases, when does the 5-year clock actually expire?
Stamp duty leases. Our view is that the extension of a stamp duty lease is treated as the grant of a new LBTT lease for the period of the extension. That's also Revenue Scotland's view. I know that there are some advisors who think that no LBTT is payable. As I say, that's not our view, although there are some respectable arguments in favour of that view. So if we are extending a stamp duty lease, we pay LBTT on it, based on the period of the extension and the passing rent. If a stamp duty lease can't be varied to increase the rent in a way which would attract LBTT, because it's too long ago that these stamp duty leases started, isn't it? And tacit relocation of stamp duty leases, there's no LBTT on that, so you can keep tacitly relocating without any danger of getting into the LBTT regime. Although, of course, you might want to change the terms in a way that means tacit relocation is no longer an option.
Next up, assignation of an LBTT lease. If it's an ordinary LBTT lease, which is in the 3-yearly return regime, i.e. it's not been exempted by a relief, then the outgoing tenant has to do one of these LBTT review returns based on the position as at the date of assignation. So the purpose of that is to kind of true up the rent up to the date of assignation and make sure that while the outgoing tenant has been tenant under the lease, that they have effectively been responsible for all LBTT on all the rent that is known up to that point. The incoming tenant does not have to do an LBTT return when they take assignation of the lease, with one exception which I'll cover, but instead they then step into the shoes of the outgoing tenant, and they inherit their timescale for 3-yearly returns. The one exception to doing LBTT returns as an incoming tenant is if you are actually paying a premium for the assignation, so you're buying the old tenant out. In those cases, if the premium is over £40,000, there will be an LBTT return. And just to avoid any confusion, that will be a return on the basis of conveyance or transfer rather than the grant of a lease. So it's a separate thing from the actual leases returns that need to be done. This raises an important point of due diligence. As an incoming tenant, you'll want to see all the LBTT returns submitted by or on behalf of the outgoing tenant, as well as the basis on which those returns have been calculated. So, for example, if there are estimated rents because it's a wind farm lease, then you're going to see or want to see the basis of those estimates to make sure that they're reasonable and you agree with them. And this isn't just seeing the last return either, it's really seeing the full history. This should put the client in first of all, a good position to know whether there are any issues, but it also means that when the incoming tenant has to submit their next 3-yearly return, they know exactly what figures to use. And for the avoidance of doubt, the incoming tenant's next 3-yearly return is going to be based on what is in the outgoing tenant's assignation return. So they're going to be updating the old assignation return.
I mean, obviously you can provide contractually that the outgoing tenant's got to indemnify the incoming tenant if there's any issue with the LBTT, but you're far better off making sure, if you're the incoming tenant, just making sure that you're happy that the outgoing tenant has actually paid everything that they should.
So that's ordinary LBTT leases. SDLT leases continue to be subject to SDLT on assignation. So assignation of an SDLT lease doesn't in and of itself, if it's an ordinary SDLT lease, trigger a requirement to do an assignation return, and it doesn't push the incoming tenant into LBTT. The rent just stays, the lease just stays as an SDLT lease. The only exception to this is if the lease has been extended, then you're going to find potentially that there's an LBTT lease as well. Also, as before, if there's a premium paid for the assignation, then the incoming tenant is going to have to do a return on the basis of conveyance or transfer. Those are ordinary LBTT and SDLT leases. You'll remember at the outset we said that if there's a lease subject to a relief, it's not subject to the 3-yearly returns rules. Well, if there's an assignation to a party that doesn't qualify for the same relief, so if you've got a lease that benefits from group relief and it's assigned outside the group, then the assignation is treated as the grant of a new lease for LBTT purposes. This means that the incoming tenant is going to be responsible for paying LBTT on all of the remaining rent for the remainder of the term of the lease. So this means that they will have to do a normal leases LBTT return when they step in as tenant under the lease, and they're potentially going to bear a rather large LBTT hit.
This does catch people out.
Yes.
If it's not been spotted, it can be a real surprise.
And in our view, this is really, whenever you're doing an assignation, the fundamental question you should be asking first is, were there any reliefs on this? Because it's important to factor that in. Also, just worth noting quickly that it's treated as a grant of a new lease by the old tenant to the new tenant. So that means if you are buying, say, from an OpCo-PropCo structure, there's not going to be group relief on that lease because the old tenant and the new tenant won't be grouped, even though the landlord and the tenants will always be in the same group.
So, just a quick word on renunciations. The tenant has to do an LBTT lease review return because the lease is terminating. The landlord may have to pay LBTT if the landlord's actually paying for the renunciation. If the tenant's paying, that's a reverse premium, so there won't be any LBTT on that. And finally, for those SDLT leases that are hanging around, you are still supposed to make 5-yearly returns on them. And we've just been doing one actually at the moment, a relatively complicated one. And if you've got leases that are tacitly relocating, then you might have SDLT returns each year. So that brings us to the end of the formal part of the seminar. If there are any questions which occur to you afterwards, then send them by email, as Bob said at the outset. As I say, we'll be delighted to receive any questions by email.
Also, just to say, hope everyone has found this useful who's been listening, and of course, if you do have any other areas of LBTT or Scottish tax that you think it would be useful to have a webinar on, do let us know, and we'd be delighted to look at that too.
But we're also very keen to hear of issues that people have with the operation of the 3-yearly return system and so on. It's still quite new, and Revenue Scotland are still in listening mode about it. So, any complex problems that are arising, they'd like to know about them. So, we can pass on comments through. I'm involved in the Law Society Tax Committee, as people may know. So we have a meeting coming up with Revenue Scotland in a few weeks' time, and complex lease questions and the 3-yearly return system and all the rest of it and also the burden on tenants and things like that is something that they're keen to hear about, to check whether there's anything, any changes that can be made to improve this position. Okay, well, thanks very much everyone for your attention. We're glad that so many people signed up, and we look forward to speaking to you again in due course when we organise another of these webinars. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.